Bastogne was supposed to be quiet. In December 1944, the small Belgian town sat at a crossroads of frozen roads and bare forests, far from the glamour of Paris or the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy. For American soldiers passing through, it felt like a pause, a place to rest, regroup, and wait out the winter. Snow covered everything: fields, rooftops, the narrow streets that twisted through town. Breath froze in the air, boots crunched against ice. The war felt distant, muffled by cold and exhaustion. Most believed the Germans were finished. The front had moved east. The enemy was retreating. Bastogne was a rear area now, a quiet sector held by tired units that needed time more than anything else. The men talked about Christmas, about home, about surviving long enough to see the war end. Then the forest woke up. Before dawn, the stillness shattered. Artillery thunder rolled through the Ardennes, deep and relentless, shaking windows and rattling nerves. Roads that had been empty hours earlier filled with refugees, wounded soldiers, and broken units retreating in confusion. The German offensive had begun. Columns of armor and infantry surged out of the forest, moving fast through terrain the Allies believed impassable in winter. American lines cracked and bent under the weight of the attack. Units were bypassed, surrounded, erased from the map in hours. Bastogne lay directly in the path of it all. The town was not important for its size or buildings. It mattered because of its roads, 7 of them, spreading outward like spokes of a wheel. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement across the Ardennes, and the Germans wanted it. American forces rushed in as the noose tightened. Paratroopers from the 101st Airborne, elements of armor and infantry, support units never meant to fight as frontline troops. They arrived cold, understrength, and short on supplies, but they arrived in time. By nightfall, the sound of German guns echoed from every direction. Bastogne was surrounded. No clear front, no open roads, no guarantee of resupply. Snow fell harder as the temperature dropped, sealing the town inside a white silence broken only by artillery and distant engines. The men dug in where they could: cellars, shallow foxholes, frozen fields. There was no grand plan, only a simple truth that settled quickly over everyone there. If Bastogne fell, the German advance would pour through the Ardennes unchecked. So the Americans stayed. They did not know how long the siege would last. They did not know if help would come. They only knew that retreat was no longer an option. As night closed in, Bastogne became something else entirely. Not a town, not a crossroads, a line. And the men inside it were about to learn what it meant to hold when everything else was already lost. By the second day, Bastogne no longer felt like a town. It felt like an island. German forces closed the roads one by one, cutting supply lines with speed and precision. Checkpoints that had flown American flags hours earlier fell silent. Convoys meant to reach the town vanished into the forest. Radio messages became shorter, more urgent, then stopped altogether. Snow kept falling. It buried wrecked vehicles along the roads and softened the sound of distant gunfire, giving the illusion of calm where none existed. Inside the perimeter, American units scrambled to form a defense with whatever they had. Paratroopers took positions alongside tank crews, artillerymen, cooks, clerks, anyone who could carry a rifle. There was no time to sort units properly. Bastogne had to hold as a whole, or not at all. The temperature dropped well below freezing. Men wrapped themselves in blankets scavenged from houses and barns. Boots froze solid overnight. Fingers lost feeling. Frostbite set in quickly, claiming toes, ears, and noses without warning. Ammunition was counted carefully now. Food was rationed to the point of absurdity. 1 cold meal a day, sometimes less. Water froze inside canteens. Medical supplies ran dangerously low even as casualties mounted. The wounded filled basements and cellars. Medics worked in darkness, using flashlights sparingly to avoid drawing fire. Bandages were reused. Morphine was rationed. Men screamed into coats and fists so others could sleep, or at least try to. German artillery began to zero in. Shells crashed into the outskirts of town, tearing through houses and scattering debris across frozen streets. Fires burned briefly before dying in the snow. Each impact sent a message. The siege was tightening, and the enemy was willing to grind Bastogne down piece by piece. Still, the Americans held. Commanders moved constantly, coordinating defenses, shifting units to meet threats that came from every direction. Radios crackled with fragmented reports, but the message was always the same. Hold the line. No retreat, no surrender. Somewhere beyond the frozen forest, higher headquarters struggled to understand the scale of the attack. Plans were drawn. Orders were written. But for the men inside Bastogne, none of that mattered yet. They were alone. As night fell again, German infantry probed the perimeter, testing for weakness. Shots rang out in the darkness. Flares burst overhead, casting harsh white light over snow-covered fields and trembling silhouettes. The siege was no longer coming. It had arrived, and Bastogne was about to learn how much it could endure. The third day stripped away any remaining illusions. German attacks came without pattern now. Not full assaults, not yet. Just constant pressure designed to exhaust and confuse. Sniper fire cracked from tree lines. Mortars fell at random hours, denying the Americans even the comfort of predictability. Sleep became a luxury no one could afford. Men dozed in short bursts, waking instantly at the sound of incoming fire. Bodies stiffened from cold and tension. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, dulling focus and slowing reactions. The cold was no longer something to endure. It was something that actively fought them. German infantry began pushing closer. They moved cautiously, using woods and folds in the terrain to approach the perimeter. Each probe forced American units to shift, reinforcing one sector at the expense of another. The defense stretched thinner with every hour. Ammunition dwindled. Artillery crews rationed shells. Machine gun teams counted belts round by round. Riflemen scavenged ammunition from abandoned positions and fallen comrades, redistributing it wherever the line seemed weakest. Medical conditions worsened rapidly. Wounded men lay in makeshift aid stations without heat, without proper supplies, without hope of evacuation. Frostbite spread. Infection followed. Medics made impossible choices: who could be saved and who had to wait. Outside the town, German commanders tightened the ring. They believed time was on their side. The Americans were surrounded, frozen, and undersupplied. Logic said the resistance would collapse under its own weight. Inside Bastogne, the logic was different. The men understood something simple and brutal. Survival depended on holding together. There was no retreat route, no fallback position. Every unit, no matter how battered, was part of the same fragile wall. That afternoon, German artillery unleashed one of the heaviest barrages yet. Shells slammed into Bastogne in quick succession, collapsing buildings, tearing up roads, and showering defenders with debris. The town shook. Smoke and dust hung low over the streets, mixing with falling snow. When the barrage lifted, German infantry advanced. The Americans met them with everything they had left. Fighting erupted along the perimeter, short, violent clashes that flared and faded just as quickly. Grenades exploded in frozen fields. Rifles fired from shattered windows and shallow foxholes. The enemy was driven back, but only barely. As night fell, Bastogne still stood, but it stood thinner, colder, and more fragile than ever. The siege was no longer about territory. It was about endurance, and whether the men inside the ring could last longer than the enemy expected. By the fourth day, the cold became the enemy everyone feared most. Temperatures dropped even lower, biting through uniforms never designed for an Ardennes winter. Snow hardened into ice. Foxholes froze solid overnight. Men woke unable to move their fingers, boots stuck to the ground, bodies aching from hours spent shivering instead of sleeping. There were no winter coats. Paratroopers wrapped themselves in tablecloths, curtains, anything they could pull from abandoned houses. Some cut holes in blankets and wore them like ponchos. Others layered newspaper under their jackets, desperate for even the smallest barrier against the cold. Food was nearly gone. A single meal was divided among several men. Cold rations, if available at all, were eaten slowly, carefully, as if savoring them might make them last longer. Hunger became constant, a dull pressure that never faded. The wounded paid the highest price. Without proper heat or supplies, injuries worsened quickly. Frostbite turned skin dark and numb. Men who might have survived under better conditions slipped away quietly in basements and cellars, their bodies giving out long before their will did. German artillery returned with precision. Shells struck command posts, aid stations, and roads already choked with debris. Buildings collapsed, trapping the wounded inside. Fires flared briefly before dying in the snow, leaving only smoke and broken walls behind. Still, the line held. American artillery fired back when it could, adjusting by sound rather than sight. Each shell was precious. Every shot had to matter. Observers risked sniper fire to relay corrections, knowing that a single accurate barrage could break an attack before it reached the perimeter. Late in the afternoon, German infantry pushed hard against the eastern edge of Bastogne. They advanced under a cover of smoke, closing the distance quickly. Fighting erupted house to house, room to room. Rifles fired down stairwells. Grenades detonated in frozen hallways. The defenders gave ground by inches, then stopped. They stopped because there was nowhere left to go. As darkness fell again, Bastogne remained in American hands. The town was battered. The men were exhausted beyond measure. Supplies were almost gone. The enemy was still all around them. But the siege had reached a turning point. The Germans were beginning to understand something they did not expect. Bastogne was not collapsing. It was refusing. The fifth day brought a message the Germans believed would end the siege. It arrived under a white flag. German officers approached the American lines cautiously, escorted through the snow-covered outskirts of Bastogne. They carried a written demand, formal and confident, convinced that logic and pressure had finally done their work. The message was clear. The American forces in Bastogne were completely surrounded. Their situation was hopeless. Continued resistance would only lead to unnecessary loss of life. Surrender was offered as the sensible choice. Inside Bastogne, the note was passed up the chain of command. Cold hands unfolded the paper. Officers read it twice, then looked at one another in disbelief. Not because the situation was good, it wasn't, but because the demand misunderstood something fundamental about the men holding the line. They were already past the point where logic applied. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe was summoned. He read the German ultimatum, paused for a moment, then laughed. It was not a laugh of humor, but of exhaustion and defiance mixed together. His response was immediate. One word. Nuts. The staff stared at him, unsure whether they had heard correctly. McAuliffe repeated it. That was the answer. Nothing more was needed. The message captured exactly how the Americans felt. About the demand, about the siege, about surrender. The reply was typed, translated, and handed back to the German envoys. When they read it, confusion crossed their faces. They asked for a clarification. An American officer explained calmly what the word meant. The Germans left. Inside Bastogne, the message spread quickly. It passed from foxhole to foxhole, from cellar to cellar, whispered and repeated with growing disbelief and pride. It did not bring food or ammunition. It did not stop the shells from falling. But it did something just as important. It reminded the men why they were still there, that surrender was no longer a part of the equation, that the line would hold no matter the cost. As night fell once more over the frozen town, German artillery resumed its pounding. Infantry shifted positions, preparing for renewed assaults. The siege was far from over. But something had changed. Bastogne was no longer just surrounded. It was defiant. The German response to nuts was immediate. Artillery fire intensified, heavier and more deliberate than before. Shells fell across Bastogne without pause, tearing through streets, fields, and shattered buildings. The town shook constantly, as if the ground itself were being punished for refusing to yield. The Americans dug deeper. Men pressed themselves into frozen earth, cellars, and rubble, using anything that could stop fragments and shrapnel. Snow mixed with dust and smoke, turning daylight into a gray haze that never fully cleared. Hearing dulled, time lost meaning. German infantry attacked again, this time with determination sharpened by insult. They pushed hard against multiple sectors at once, trying to overwhelm the perimeter through sheer pressure. Machine guns hammered American positions. Mortars walked closer and closer, forcing defenders to fight from exposed ground. The Americans answered with what little they had left. Artillery fired sparingly, each shell carefully chosen. Machine gun crews rotated barrels until they burned too hot to touch. Riflemen shared ammunition, passing clips down the line without words. The wounded lay everywhere. Aid stations overflowed. Medics worked with bare hands, sleeves rolled up, faces hollow with exhaustion. There was no heat, no proper light. Pain was constant, untreated, accepted as part of survival. Late in the afternoon, the Germans nearly broke through. A concentrated assault slammed into the southern edge of Bastogne, collapsing part of the defense. For a brief moment, enemy infantry poured into the outskirts of town, fighting through snow and debris at close range. American units counterattacked immediately. Cooks, drivers, clerks, men who had never expected to fight like this, grabbed rifles and moved forward. The line surged, stopped, then surged again. Fighting became chaotic and brutal, room to room, hedge to hedge. Then, slowly, the Germans were pushed back. Not decisively, not cleanly, but enough. As night fell, the perimeter still existed. Bastogne remained surrounded. Supplies were gone. Men were at the edge of collapse. German forces were still all around them. But the siege had failed to break the Americans, and far beyond the frozen forests, something else was finally beginning to move. Relief was on the way. The seventh day began under a sky that finally changed. The clouds broke just enough to let pale sunlight through, reflecting off the snow-covered fields around Bastogne. For the first time since the siege began, visibility stretched beyond a few hundred yards. Men looked up instinctively, squinting against the light, unsure whether to trust it. Then they heard it. Aircraft. At first it sounded distant, almost imagined. Then the roar grew louder, unmistakable. American planes appeared overhead, cutting through the cold air in long, steady lines. Cheers erupted across the perimeter, weak at first, then spreading, echoing through ruined streets and frozen fields. Supply drops followed. Crates tumbled from the sky, parachutes blooming white against the gray. Ammunition, food, medical supplies. Not nearly enough to end the siege, but enough to breathe again. Men ran into open ground under lingering fire to retrieve what they could. Some crates landed beyond the perimeter, drifting into enemy-held areas. Others smashed on impact, scattering precious contents across the snow. Every usable item was grabbed, carried, shared. For the first time in days, the wounded received proper care. Morphine eased pain. Bandages were replaced. Food reached men who had not eaten in what felt like forever. Hope returned cautiously, fragile but real. The Germans reacted quickly. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Artillery resumed with renewed urgency, shells crashing down as if to punish the Americans for daring to believe. Infantry probes followed. testing whether the supply drops had softened the defense. They had not. The line held firm, reinforced not by numbers but by morale. The men stood straighter, weapons were steadier, eyes sharpened with renewed purpose. That afternoon, radio traffic confirmed what many had hoped but dared not say aloud. American forces were pushing hard from the south. Armor was advancing. The ring around Bastogne was beginning to strain. The siege was not over, but it was cracking. As darkness fell again, Bastogne remained under fire. The cold returned. Hunger still lingered. Men still died. Yet the town no longer felt like a grave waiting to be filled. It felt like a position being held just long enough. And in war, sometimes that is everything. The eighth day exposed the true cost of the siege. Even with supplies falling from the sky, the damage had already been done. Men moved slowly now, bodies weakened by days of hunger and cold. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Faces were drawn tight, eyes sunken, uniforms stiff with ice and grime. The battlefield around Bastogne had changed. German positions were still there, but their movements were different. Less confident, less aggressive. Patrols pulled back sooner. Attacks lacked the coordination they once had. The enemy was beginning to feel the strain of time slipping away. American artillery, now partially resupplied, found its voice again. Shells landed with renewed accuracy, breaking up German formations before they could reach the perimeter. Each successful barrage pushed the enemy a little farther back, reclaiming ground that had been lost inch by inch. Inside the town, the wounded were evacuated when possible. Those who could not be moved were made as comfortable as conditions allowed. Medics worked without pause, driven by the knowledge that every hour survived brought the possibility of rescue closer. Death still came, but it no longer felt inevitable. German infantry attempted one final coordinated push that afternoon. It lacked the fury of earlier assaults. The Americans met it with steady, disciplined fire. Machine guns held firm. Rifles cracked in controlled bursts. Grenades stopped a movement before it could gain momentum. The attack broke quickly. As evening fell, the sounds around Bastogne shifted again. Artillery grew sporadic. Infantry movement thinned. The forest beyond the town no longer felt alive with hostile intent. The siege was loosening. Men who had not smiled in days allowed themselves brief moments of relief, a shared cigarette, a quiet joke, a look toward the southern horizon where the sound of distant engines hinted at what was coming. Still, no one relaxed completely. Experience had taught them better. Bastogne had endured the worst the enemy could deliver. Now it waited, battered, scarred, but unbroken, for the final chapter to be written. The sound came from the south. At first it was faint, a low rumble carried through frozen air, barely different from distant artillery. No one reacted. Bastogne had taught its defenders not to trust sound, not to trust hope. Then it grew louder, engines, heavy ones, moving steadily, not probing, not stopping. German artillery answered almost immediately, firing in scattered bursts, rushed and uneven. The pattern was familiar now. The enemy knew what was coming. By mid-morning, the first American units broke through the outer German positions. Tanks pushed forward along shattered roads, infantry advancing behind them with careful precision. The fighting was sharp, but brief. German resistance collapsed quickly, pulled back by orders that had come too late. The siege was broken. Men inside Bastogne struggled to react. Some cheered weakly. Others simply sat down where they stood, bodies too exhausted to process what their eyes were seeing. A few stared in silence, afraid that movement might make the moment disappear. Relief forces moved into the town cautiously, checking every street, every building, every approach. Medics followed close behind, stunned by what they found. Soldiers hollowed by hunger and cold, wounds untreated for days, frostbite so severe it blackened flesh. These were not fresh troops holding a line, they were survivors of something far worse. As German forces withdrew deeper into the Ardennes, Bastogne slowly reconnected to the world beyond the siege. Roads opened, radios cleared, orders flowed again. The men who had held the town were pulled back one by one. Some were evacuated immediately. Others stayed just long enough to be replaced. A few insisted on remaining at their posts until ordered away, unwilling to leave the ground they had defended for so long. By late afternoon, the firing had mostly stopped. Bastogne was no longer surrounded. The town stood battered and broken, its streets scarred by shell fire, its buildings reduced to rubble. Snow continued to fall, covering everything in a thin white layer, already beginning to erase the evidence of what had been endured. The battle moved on, but for the men who had survived the siege, nothing would ever move the same way again. Bastogne disappeared back into the snow as the war moved on. New orders arrived, new fronts opened. The German offensive collapsed under pressure it could no longer sustain. What had once been a desperate stand at a frozen crossroads became another line in reports, another mark on a map already crowded with arrows and dates. For the men who held Bastogne, there was no clean ending. Some were sent to hospitals, their bodies damaged beyond quick repair. Others returned to the line after only days of rest, carrying the siege with them into the next fight. Many would never fully recover from the cold, the hunger, or the wounds that came too late to treat properly. Those who did return home struggled to explain it. They talked about the cold first, about the silence between shelling, about the way time stopped meaning anything at all. They did not talk much about fear. Bastogne entered American memory as a symbol, a place where surrender was demanded and refused, where a single word captured the spirit of an entire defense. But for the soldiers who lived it, the meaning was simpler and heavier. They stayed because they had to. They held because letting go meant something worse than death. They endured because the men beside them were still enduring. The siege did not break the war on its own, but it broke something just as important. It proved that the German offensive could be stopped. That winter isolation and desperation were not enough. That even when everything was lost, the line could still hold. Today, Bastogne is quiet again. Snow still falls in winter. Roads still cross where armies once fought. Visitors walk streets unaware of how close everything came to breaking apart there. But beneath that quiet lies the truth of December 1944. A town surrounded, soldiers frozen and starving, an enemy demanding surrender, and Americans who answered by holding the line until the world caught up to them.